Man, how do you follow these stories? It's incredible. If you know the Harrises, you just know just how gracious and loving they are. In fact, Jeremy and I kind of grew up together. His dad was one of my pastors. Jeremy knew me before I knew Jesus, and he has stories. And what an honor it is that they're at Lake Church and just see what God's done. So much fun. Probably the most difficult conversation I've had this weekend was explaining to my 7-year-old daylight savings time. I mean, no joke. I mean, it's hard. She couldn't figure out if we had 23 hours today. I wasn't sure if we had 23 hours today after the conversation with her. She couldn't understand why she had to go to bed early, which seems like we have that conversation almost every night. But I do know this, is that conversation, I think, is actually more difficult than the conversation Jesus was having with his disciples about the end times. Jesus is actually pretty simple when it comes to the end times. And I think we kind of make it more difficult than he ever intended it to be. And with everything going on over the last week or so, I mean, this has kind of brought up a lot of questions, and we happen to be in a portion of the scriptures where the questions of, is Jesus coming back? I've heard that so many times this week. I've had people text me or email me. If you probably have been watching YouTube or other things, and is Armageddon right around the corner? Right? In fact, there was a really popular preacher, very popular preacher, writer, who made some predictions this past week. And essentially, kind of there's this theory out there that once Israel reclaimed its nationhood, whether you recognize that in 1948 or 1967, that starts this generational countdown. And a generation from a Hebrew perspective is 100 years. And so essentially what he's saying is that 100 years from either 48 or 67, Jesus is coming back. That's a pretty bold statement, right? I mean, and by the way, that's just a mid-20th century idea. There's no historical or biblical basis for this. The reality is we do not know. We don't know. Or is Armageddon right around the corner? I mean, think about it. You got, Russia and Ukraine going at it. You got things in sub-Saharan Africa. You've got what's happening in the Middle East with Iran and Israel and the U.S. And now I saw that the Houthis are getting into it this morning, and Turkey can't decide what allegiance they're going to have. And China and North Korea and Russia are having tea together. And there's all these thrilling ideas out there, but they have very little to do with the Bible. By the way, because I know you were wondering, Armageddon appears one time. The word appears one time in Scripture. Revelation 16:16, it tells us that the kings of the earth gather at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. That's all it says. That's it. There's no explanation, no tactical overview. There's no military description. There's no geography lesson. And for an event destined to become the largest war in human history, the Bible shows strikingly little interest in the details. And that's intentional. That's intentional. Because the point in Jesus talking about the end times isn't so that we look for the puzzle to figure it all out, but rather that we look and make sure that we are faithful. See, we have the tendency to build these massive ideologies around things with very little information. And Jesus says, would you be faithful? Would you be faithful? So I kind of buried the lead this morning because that's it. That's the message. But I want you to look at Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he preached the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest message by the greatest preacher in the history of the world, revolutionary. At the end of his life, he preached a long sermon called the Olivet Discourse. And it's 5 stories. We're going to look at 3 of those stories today. And the Olivet Discourse kind of bookends his public ministry from the Sermon on the Mount. And he preached the Olivet Discourse on the Tuesday before his crucifixion, and it's about the end times and his return. So Matthew chapter 24. And by the way, this might be one of the most abused passages anywhere in Scripture. I mean, there's some folks that say that everything in this passage has already been fulfilled in 70 AD. That's called preterism. That's not true. Some have the opposite extreme, and they scour the news of wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilence and earthquakes and heavenly signs and wonders and blood-red moons and all of that fun stuff. Some think that the discourse is this puzzle that he's giving to unlock this code. You might have even read a book about this. And every few years, there's somebody who claims to be a prophet who comes alongside these passages and says, I think I figured it out. And yet Jesus emphatically says in chapter 24, verse 36, he says, on that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, my Father knows. That's who knows. And then he says it again in verse 42 and verse 44 and verse 50. Kind of get the point. Chapter 25, verse 13. No one knows. So what's the point? You're going to find that the point is this, is for us to be faithful. To be faithful to the end. Regardless of when that end is. To be faithful. Hey, we're going to have fun. I know you may be sleepy. I'm not sleepy. I've had like 6 cups of coffee this morning. So if I start dancing, if I do some jumping jacks, this is going to be fun this morning. Okay, so turn to Matthew 24, verse 45. Okay? And here's where we're going. Again, there's kind of 5 stories. There's 5 parables that Jesus talks about in this, what's called the Olivet Discourse. We're looking at 3 of those, kind of the 3 middle ones this morning. Verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all of his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, the first story we're looking at this morning, there's 2 servants. Incredible contrast here intentionally. One is faithful and wise, one is evil. And the wise and faithful servant knew that the master's absence actually amplified the burden of responsibility for him. And whether the master returned early or late, this wise servant wanted to be found doing his father's work. There's a term that Marines have called fire watch. It's a great term. And this is when a Marine is on duty and has to watch long hours, and they have to ensure the security, make sure that nothing is out of the ordinary. And here's what the faithful and wise steward was doing. He was on a fire watch. But the evil servant, he saw the master's absence as an opportunity to cut up, to party, just kind of do whatever he wanted to do. Whatever his evil heart inclined him to do, just because there's nobody to watch him, no accountability. By the way, there's an integrity issue here with this other servant. Your character and integrity are always truest when nobody is actually looking. And here, the master was out, and we see his true colors. But then the master suddenly returns. And the faithful servant is rewarded beyond expectation. He's immediately promoted to the highest position of authority, of honor. And here this evil servant, who represents a self-deluded unbeliever whose lack of faith, just emboldened his evil conduct. So when the master does return, suddenly there's and suddenly much sooner than I think they expected, the evil servant is instantly exposed for who he is. In fact, his punishment is as severe as the reward of the first servant was lavish. It says in verse 51 that he was cut in two. That's fatal. But it wasn't the end for him. In fact, it says that he went somewhere else. There was an eternal side of this that was really unfortunate. It says that he's going to a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. See, here's the lesson, that Christ's return is imminent. So be faithful. Be faithful. Look at chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. By the way, there's some chapter divisions that you see here from 24 to 25, and those are artificial interruptions in the narrative. The chapter and verse divisions aren't a part of the inspired text. They were added about the 13th century to make it easier to read. So there's no interruption or interlude between these parables, okay? It would have been just one long message. But here's what he says. Chapter 25, verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to the bridegroom. I don't ever label my sermons, but I was going to label this one Servants, Virgins, and Talents. I think it'd get some good play online. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. And the bridegroom was delayed. They all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." So again, here we have, this would have been the third parable back to back here. And this makes the point that we have to be ready for him to return at any time. We can't be caught off guard. We're watching, but we're also waiting. True readiness requires us to manage our expectations, to pay attention as we watch and we wait. But keep in mind too, church history is full of stories of date setters and their cults who think that they have figured out when Jesus is coming back. In fact, you'll see people quit their jobs. They'll sell all of their assets. They'll move to the mountains or the desert, and they'll wait for the trumpet to sound. There was a guy recently, you may remember, I think his name was Joshua. He was a self-proclaimed prophet back in September, like just the other day. September 23rd and 24th, and he said, "The end is coming." And if it did, you guys are in trouble. But I like your chances this morning. Or maybe you remember that guy, Harold Camping. He was a family radio broadcaster for years, spent millions of dollars on a campaign in 2011. And he said the end was coming. He actually made the same prediction in 1994. Nobody hears from Harold Camping any longer. It's not because he got taken. Or maybe John Hagee, who in 2014 had this idea of the blood red tetrad. And he was saying that there was this impending apocalypse. Listen, I have a better chance of predicting the Cowboys winning a Super Bowl in the next 20 years than any of you do in predicting when Jesus comes back. Here's what I can promise you. Not because I have some type of special knowledge, just because Jesus says it over and over again. Is that if you hear somebody making a prediction and when he's coming back, he ain't coming back that day. Okay? Why? Because nobody knows the day that he comes back. But do know this, without qualification, Jesus is coming back. And he is coming back for his bride, and he will come back with all of his glory. In fact, Paul knew this in Romans 13:11. He says, wake up, get out of your sleep, for now our salvation is nearer today than when we first believed. 1 Peter 4:7 says, the end of all things is at hand, therefore be serious and watchful in all of your prayers. Listen, he's coming. Guaranteed. But our ignorance in the timing of Christ's return has some other implications that Jesus wants us to be really aware of, and that's to be patient, diligent, and faithful. We are to be watching and waiting, regardless of how long he may delay. In fact, 1 Peter talks about this, and this is good for us to know and to understand, because in all of God's eternality, or his aseity, his self-existence, he doesn't live on our timetable. He doesn't enter into our time in the same way that we enter into time. Rather, his time is wholly different. And I love what Peter says in 2 Peter 3:8. He says, with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, like some might count slackness, but he's long-suffering toward us, not willing that anyone would perish, but that all would come to know him through repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. And that's good news. It's great news that he's patient. But we don't know when he's coming. And while we wait, we are to be faithful. Well, he's talking about this wedding feast. I kind of digressed a little bit. He's talking about this wedding feast, and this is an unusually large wedding party. I mean, this is a grand feast, major occasion. But here's the problem. It's getting late. The bridegroom hasn't arrived yet. The bridesmaids have fallen asleep. Their ceremonial lamps are burning out. Half of the girls didn't bring extra oil, making it impossible for them to refill their lamps. And without proper lamps, they can't perform the one simple task that they're supposed to perform. Now, it's late. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a midnight wedding. I have not. That would not be completely unusual in the first century. Most of their weddings were later in the evening. And by the way, there's kind of three phases of a first century Jewish wedding. The first phase was the promise of marriage. And this was usually done through a contract between the two families or sets of parents. And it was sealed with a payment by the groom's father. Now, Laura and I have already decided we're going to do the same type of thing for Lucy. I'm not making the payment, but we are going to sign that contract. The second phase is the betrothal. No lie, actually. When my oldest daughter, who's now 19, when she was 7, I had her sign a contract that I found, and it is in her dorm room today. It's not hanging up, but I have it. The second one is a betrothal. And this was the public exchange of vows and gifts between the couple. And at this point, they were legally committed to marry one another. But the marriage was not fully consummated until the third phase, and that was the wedding feast. And this might come as late as a year into the betrothal. But it was marked by the completion of the betrothal period with this large celebration that could last several days. And only after the banquet did the couple live together. And what this parable is describing is day one of the marriage feast. Day one of that third phase. The groom is back. He let him know, hey, I'm headed your way. And so the bridegroom's arrival would signal the start of the festivities. The bridesmaids would come out to meet him and escort him through the streets of the village or the city to his destination with those oil-fueled lamps. And in this case, the bridegroom was a little bit later than normal. He was really late. And it doesn't tell us why he's late. I can assure you it would have been a good reason. And I can say that because it's clear that the bridegroom wasn't indifferent about the wedding. He wasn't aloof toward his bride, because once he got there, he was ready to party. Like, he shut the door and he didn't let anybody else in. He was ready for the feast. But all was ready except for those 5 foolish bridesmaids who had left the premises to buy more oil in the middle of the night. They weren't going to find it. In fact, their absence would have been more than just an annoyance for the bridegroom. It was incredibly thoughtless of them not to bring oil, extra oil, in the first place. They weren't ready. Keeping a burning lamp was their one duty. And as soon as it was known that the groom was coming, these irresponsible girls woke up. They tried to go buy some more. Then they returned and they begged to be admitted to the feast. But the door was closed. In verse 12, Jesus has kind of a chilling response to this. He says, I say to you, I do not know you. Similar to what he said in Matthew 7:23 when he said, I never knew you, depart from me. Here's the thing. Christ, the bridegroom, is coming. He's coming. He may arrive later than you expect, but you got to be prepared. You got to be ready for that possibility. And those who aren't ready for him when he arrives, they will be completely and permanently shut out from the feast. So be faithful. Be faithful. Look at chapter 25, verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away, and he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, review real quick. The first story we looked at of the 2 servants talks about expectantly watching. We're to be expectantly watching. Then those bridesmaids and the groom were to be patiently waiting. And now we see here with the talents that we're to be diligently working. Watching, waiting, working. That's the essence of being faithful according to Jesus. Watching, waiting, and working. And as it relates here, there's prudent planning involved. Listen, the Bible never hates on prudent planning. It's not antithetical to living by faith. Whether a failure to plan for the future, that's not faith, that's foolishness. And the parable of the talents commends faithful work, prudent planning. Again, there's this rich man who travels to a faraway place. He appoints 3 of his servants as managers over specific allotments of his wealth. 2 of them put the money to work, and they double the portion. The third buries his treasure, and it gains nothing. Again, in the 2 previous stories, that it showed that expectation has to be tempered with patience. This story reminds us that whether Christ returns early or late, that he ought to find us busy, working, watching, waiting, and working. So these 3 servants, they were entrusted with this immense responsibility. It says that they were given talents. One was given 5, one was given 2, one was given 1. Now, a talent is not a coin. It's not a currency. It's a weight. But it's a lot of weight. In fact, it would have been between 60 and 70 pounds. To give you an idea, it says in Leviticus 25, when it's talking about the menorah in the tabernacle, that the menorah weighed a talent. It was huge. And so one talent of gold today would be millions, tens of millions of dollars. So even the person who had 1 talent, don't think that, they were just managing like $5 in a Chipotle gift card. They had millions of dollars worth of responsibility. Well, 2 of the 3 faithfully set to work and fulfilled their duty. The third literally did nothing. He dug a hole, buried it, and he went to party. He took advantage of the boss's absence to do whatever he wanted to. And, maybe we can give him the benefit of the doubt that he was trying to avoid financial risk. Maybe he thought that there was going to be, a downturn in the market and gas prices were going to rise. And maybe he thought that he would be the hero for saving that money for his master. But in reality, he was shirking his responsibility. He wasn't living faithfully to the duty that he had been called. It says in verse 14 that the master's journey was a long one. It says that he went to a far country. And, in that culture, it's impossible to travel long distances without, a definitive timetable. They didn't have Apple Maps just yet. And so they didn't know exactly when he would come back. And it appears that the master came back a little bit later than was expected. The trip lasted longer. And when he arrived, those that had stewarded his resources well were honored for their faithfulness, not their results. Keep that in mind. He didn't point out their profits. He pointed out their fidelity, their faithfulness. And that tells us that the master's response was one of gratitude and generosity. He rewarded the faithful stewards and expanded their authority, increased their opportunity and favor. In fact, their reward pictures what heaven's going to be like. If you think heaven is going to be this place of eternal boredom and singing, I like to sing. We got it. We got it this morning. That was good. But it is going to be a place filled with exaltation and honor and expanded opportunities and serving and the greatest of joys. But notice the unfaithful servant. He tries to deflect responsibility, deflect the judgment that he deserved by claiming that he was paralyzed by the terror of his perception of the master being a hard man, a ruthless man. Your reputation. Hey, this is a perfect case of blame shifting. Ungodly slander against the kindest of masters. And none of it was true. And even if it was, there's no excuse. He could have put the money in the bank. It could have drawn interest. The problem was that this servant was lazy. He wasn't faithful. And sadly, he was put in the same category as the wicked servant and the 5 foolish bridesmaids in the previous story. So here's the thing. This is super simple. Eschatology is really simple. Be faithful. Be faithful. And what that looks like is watching, waiting, and working. Listen, he wants faithfulness over forecasting. I think part of the reason why his messages in the Olivet Discourse are so simple, all 5 of them point to faithfulness, and that's it. That's the main point. I mean, Scripture is so dynamic. There's certain other things that come out of that. There's other principles that come out of that, but the main point is to be faithful. When Jesus is about to get on the cross and he knows what's in front of him, and he also knows that after he dies on the cross and he raises, that he is going to come back one day. He says, be faithful. He doesn't need your forecasting. Don't try to be a weatherman. Listen, enter into the storm. Endure the rain. There's going to be a lot of days that are going to be sunny too. But whatever it may be, walk faithfully. You're watching and waiting. But lastly, you're also working. Work unto the Lord. Work unto the Lord. Listen, I know that, for quite a while now, there's been a significant emphasis on rest and Sabbath and mental health and all those things. And listen, I do understand. I get it. There's... we are living in a time when the speed of life is just incredibly, it's just too busy. The amount of information that we're given and the expectations of how to synthesize that information and then get that back. It's mind-numbing in a sense. And we recognize the need for margin in our life, right? And if you don't recognize the need for margin, you're probably way too busy, because busy people can't love well. You have to have some margin in your life. But I don't want you to miss the fact that here, he's not talking about resting. Jesus is talking about running. He's talking about moving forward. Our hearts ought to resemble more like a farmer's hand that is scarred and calloused and rough when we show up to heaven. It ought to look like a well-worn baseball glove, because we've worked into the Lord. Listen, faithfulness is endurance and perseverance. It's doing the right thing even when it hurts. It's dying to self so that others can hear the good news. It's often lowering oneself so that Jesus' name can be on display. It is always hand to the plow. And I think here's the challenge that we often have, is we think that we need rest from something. And so we talk about Sabbath as this idea of rest from something. And that's not how Jesus talks about Sabbath. Rather, Jesus talks about Sabbath as rest in someone. You tracking? Sabbath is not rest from something, it's rest in someone. This is what Jesus said in Matthew 12:8. He said, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Sabbath is to be rest in someone. Why? Because that type of Sabbath rest is for our work. So that we run. Prior to Matthew 12, he said in chapter 11, come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. He's calling us to faithfulness in Him. You know, it would be a really giant bummer when you get to heaven, is if you show up in heaven and you're well rested. When you get to heaven, you ought to be worn out because you've been working unto the Lord. You've been faithful. You've been faithful. Pray. Jesus, thank you for the simplicity of your word and the reminder to not chase puzzles and to look for codes, but rather to walk faithfully in the ways that you have called us to be faithful in our stewardship, to be faithful in our time, to be faithful in our service, to be faithful as we share your good news to a watching world. And I'm so grateful, like in 2 Peter, that you're waiting because you don't want any to perish. Help us to be faithful in that season of waiting. In your holy and your precious name, amen. I want to invite you to respond to the Lord this morning. Some of our staff would be here, will be here, would love to pray with you, would love to talk with you. Would you stand as we sing together?